Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, is a fabulous co-host.
Surprise, it's not Diana, it's me, your lovable pal, Jackie.
That's right, Jackie's here. Diana, where is Diana? She's doing end-of-year college-y stuff, I think. Right, Jack? That's a sad fact. I don't actually know where she is. She's not here.
She's doing things that she has to do to maintain her job.
Okay. I knew she was not here, and I knew she was somewhere at her job. I assumed it was job-related as opposed to she's hiding from our recording. Let's assume it's not that one.
It's not that.
It's not that. Okay, good. I haven't seen her in a while. Sorry, this morning I said, I'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah, we are doing good.
That's good. Yes, it's very busy. I'm glad you have some time in between your colleging to record a podcast.
I'm just colleging and just all about the college.
Good. But folks, this isn't a podcast about how to record a podcast in between your college job or even the difficulties of seeing your spouse when they work college hours. This is a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic related to our field and discuss some relevant research articles. And this week, it's a Rob's Choice, I guess, our episode. We're going to be discussing behavior assessments that you didn't know existed. So one of the bread and butter jobs of a behavior analyst is to determine the functions of behavior. But what do we do as behavior analysts when we are asked to talk about functions of behaviors that some of us might say are best described through mentalistic talk, which would not be appropriate as a behavior analyst, or that might not sort of gently fall into one of our 4 function category boxes? Or at least they might in a sense, but not in a sense that anyone reading your report would be happy to read about. So we are going to be talking all about 2 areas in which there are behavior assessments, which you may not know have existed. And we're going to talk about how they are behavior assessments, mostly how they aren't behavior assessments in the ways that we would think of them, and what might be done in the future to change that.
I want to make one caveat too, is the 2 things that we are talking about, some issues that we're talking about, specifically mine, could be a trigger for someone. So just putting it out there that we will be talking about non-suicidal self-harm in 2 of the articles. So if that's not for you, then turn us off and come to another episode that might be better suited for you. I also want to make the caveat that we as behavior analysts, remember we need to stay within our competence. And we want to make sure that if we are treating behaviors that are outside of our competence, such as self-injury, non-suicidal self-harm, that we have taken the necessary steps to gain competence in that area so that we can work in that field, right? Behavior analysts can work in a wide variety of fields, but we might need to do a little extra training in that specific field in order to remain competent.
And confident about our competence.
And confident, right? Because if you're competent and confident, great, that's where you want to be. But if you're not competent and not confident, no.
Don't be an incompetent, confident behavior analyst. That's the worst. It's the worst mix. Yes, so we'll be talking about non-suicidal self-injury, which neither of us are experts on. I have some experience with it working with other colleagues sort of in the public school system, but it is not an area of expertise. We'll be talking about school avoidance, which is, I don't want to toot my own horn and say is an area of expertise, but
I would toot your own horn, and I think
I read a lot of books about it, and I've certainly worked with students on school avoidance and school refusal. So I will say that I am at least competent to discuss it. But we're not really going to be discussing, say, treatment. So I think our competence discussion, you might say, well, why would I listen to this podcast where you're not going to talk within your realm of competence? Well, again, some of it is within our realm of competence, but we're not going to talk specifically about treatment of, say, the non-suicidal self-injury. We're going to talk about the type of assessment that exists, whether or not it is or is not behavior analytic. It's not really, it's a questionnaire. Spoiler. But also, how does behavior analysis get involved with discussions about behaviors that have social significance, like non-suicidal self-injury or school avoidance behavior, in ways where we add to a conversation of what might a functional assessment look like, rather than just being grumpy that other fields are saying, this is a functional assessment, and I made a questionnaire, which we would say is not a very good functional assessment. But how is it a good functional assessment? How can we improve that? What could we add to the discussion other than just saying, that doesn't count as behavior analytic, I won't look at your questionnaire? Because it's better than nothing, but it might not be better than something else that we could create together.
Yeah.
So, with that out of the way, let's talk about the articles we're describing. Jackie, do you want to do the articles?
Well, Rob, I was pretty sure that you were going to ask me if I wanted to do the articles. And I thought about it and realized that I'm actually pretty bad at reading people's names and have to do a lot of work on it. So I'm going to politely decline, and I'm going to let you be an OG again.
All right, good.
And give us the articles.
I'll do the articles then. All right, so our first article that we'll be discussing tonight is Towards a Comprehensive Assessment of School Absenteeism, Development and Initial Validation of the Inventory of School Attendance Problems by Nolman, Reisner, and Heberbrand from the European Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Journal. I don't know why I put a "the" there. 2019. Characteristics and Functions of Non-Suicidal Self-Injury in a Community Sample of Adolescents by Lloyd Richardson, Perrine, Durker, and Kelly from Psychological Medicine, 2007. And Assessing the Functions of Non-Suicidal Self-Injury, Psychometric Properties of the Inventory of Statements About Self-Injury, parentheses, ISAS, by Klonsky and Glenn from the Journal of Psychopathology and Behavior Assessments, 2009. So my first thought when I heard about these, someone mentioned this. I was in a meeting and someone said, oh, we should look at these assessments on non-suicidal self-injury. And I said, there's an assessment for non-suicidal self-injury. And I saw the link and it talked about the functions of, and anytime I see the word function or assessment or behavior assessment, and I've never heard of it as a behavior analyst, I get kind of nervous, like, oh man, is this like a huge line of research that everyone knows about, but me, I'm not paying enough attention to the literature.
You've got research FOMO.
It's terrible, right? And so I immediately clicked on the links, got these articles, I got a follow-up article, and then immediately upon reading it, I said, oh, this isn't really a functional assessment of anything.
You know, but spoiler alert, for my two articles, they do try to pull it back in like 2 sentences, which I was like, I wonder why they put that there. So it'll be fun to talk about that.
Yeah. And then similarly, while I go to a lot of, talks on school avoidance, which I had historically been referring to as school refusal, but I think it's more commonly school avoidance. We'll talk about the terminology. And we did a whole episode on school refusal, school avoidance, and actually had a talk with Dr. Carney, who had created sort of what exists as kind of the functional assessment questionnaire, which again was a questionnaire, but did really couch itself in behavior analytic terminology in terms of looking at sort of, the primary functions of any behavior tend to be gain attention, gain access to tangibles, avoidance from, aversive stimuli. So that kind of was very in line with our own thoughts on the matter. But it's always sort of irked me that there are all of these phenomena, I'm sure it's irked many of you, where we can't do a standard like, well, let's just get our 4 conditions. And okay, in this condition, you're going to what? Like run away from school, refuse to go to school? And I'll give you attention when you do it. And then we'll repeat this over and over. There's sort of those one and done behaviors. You're not going to be able to do that. So a lot of the literature is on questionnaires, some level of observation, and then maybe setting up some sort of a contingency to sort of test your hypothesis. But for the most part, it turns into what I know a lot of behavior analysts get really frustrated with, even with something that is experimental, like the ISCA, where we're like, I don't know, it's probably some like combination of these things. What's the questionnaire say? It seems like this got endorsed the most, so it's probably this. So just start doing treatment for that, and we'll call it a day. Which on the one hand might be efficient, and it might even result in meaningful treatment. But on the other hand, I think always leaves me feeling like this isn't very thorough.
Yeah.
Why do anything? Why call anything a functional assessment or a behavior assessment if you're just going to say, I don't know, these are the reasons these things tend to happen, so here's all the treatments you could do, and just throw it all at the wall and see what sticks. So I thought, let's talk about these behavior assessments, which I'm assuming a lot of you would say, I didn't know there was anything that could even be remotely referred to as a behavior assessment. when we mentioned the two behaviors. Well, hopefully you know the school refusal because we spent a lot of time on that episode years ago, and I would hope you listened to it. So let's start. What shall we start with, Jackie? Diana's not here to control the conversation, which she does not do, but
that she never does that ever.
She never does.
She's the exact opposite of controlling her conversation. Why don't we start with some school refusal, I think?
All right, let's start with some school refusal. Good old school refusal. So we'll do kind of a brief background review for folks to get them up to speed, and then we'll talk about the Nolman 2019 article.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And I think, so then if people don't want to listen to, if they have, some triggers around self-harm, then they can at least listen to some of it and then turn it off at the break so that then they don't have to be scrolling, fast forwarding, being like, yuck, yuck, yuck.
Nope. Yeah, we'll do it all one and done here. All right. So when we talk about school avoidance, we're really talking about absence from public school, well, whatever school, elementary school, middle school, high school, right? And for it to be
preschool,
could be preschool. I don't know how those kids get away from it, but they might hate going to school, right? And usually this is a problem for like 5 to 10% of students. At least, again, it didn't say whether it was a worldwide cohort that they're getting this statistic. This is a German study, I believe, or at least German researchers. So this, I don't know if that is a worldwide statistic, but up to about 10% of students in any given area, I suppose, can have problematic school absenteeism. There are a lot of reasons children do not go to school, but we do know, and there's a lot of statistics to support that every day missed past, I think about 10 days within a year. Beyond that, you do start seeing significant loss of skill acquisition. You do start seeing some other sort of related challenges related to, social development and relationship development. So there are a lot of sort of bad outcomes for kids who don't go to school. Again, some of them might be kind of comorbid with the problems that might have led them to not want to go to school as well. But just not going to school on its own can cause a number of problems, cuts down on future earnings power, cuts down on future well-being, relationships, a host of problems. So the goal of this paper was to create a new, more thorough school absence assessment, which is great because I think, as we talked about with Dr. Carney with his school refusal assessment survey, it is a great step, but it kind of feels like that's the only assessment out there, and maybe it doesn't cover all of the pieces that might go into developing a treatment for school avoidance or school refusal.
Right. It's we could say it's no PDCHS. The PDCHS is an assessment for staff performance. And when you fill out the assessment, then it provides you with links to articles that can help you and guide treatment. So it's not that.
No, I mean, certainly if you do read Dr. Carney's work, the assessment does have sort of like, here's the cognitive behavior therapy that will probably work for this child. There's a lot of, treatment ideas that come from it, but it also feels like, well, I could have just picked one of these and probably gotten lucky. So is this a meaningful assessment? Yeah. And yes, it is. We're not trying to be too dismissive or anything.
No, it is a meaningful assessment, but it is no PDC. I just think the PDCHS,
it's your fave,
is literally my favorite because I'm like, here's a result, here's an article. I just think that's like so nice, right? Like, do this.
Yeah.
But and a lot of times that with assessments, you can't do that, right? It's more complex behavior. So it does make sense now, even though I've said it and I was being glib, is that the word? I think that the school refusal or school avoidance is more complex than a staff performance issue, right? Because there's probably a lot more going on. So you probably couldn't do what the PDCHS does. And so he does give lots of options, right? Because we might need lots of options depending on the resources that we have at the assessment level.
Yeah. So some quick definitions. So school attendance problem, SAP, would include all the potential reasons for not going to school. That would include things like truancy, which is usually conceptualized as an absence due to, quote, lack of motivation, end quote, and, quote, externalizing symptoms, end quote. But basically, usually people think of truancy as, I choose to do something that isn't school because I'd rather, go to the video arcade or cruise the strip. So, and usually those are behaviors that parents do not know about. So this truancy usually is more, I'm not going to school and I'm not going to tell anybody. It's a secret.
My truancy when I was in high school was going to the Dairy Queen in my town.
Nice.
Except that one time I was at the Dairy Queen in my town and my mom showed up.
Uh-oh. How embarrassing.
And she's like, "What are you doing here?" And I was like, "Oh."
When we talk about school refusal, we're usually talking about absences because of some sort of somatic complaints, or that usually are thought to be based around, they have anxiety about school, or there's some sort of depression about school. So you could talk about it from a mental health standpoint, but it typically is behaviors that allow a child to, or that lead to a child avoiding going to school, or that make going to school more difficult for the family. So it's, again, usually thought of as being something that everyone knows is happening, and they're just unclear of how to get the child to school. The child is refusing to go, and everyone knows it. They just don't know what else to do necessarily.
You can see that.
Yeah. So when we talk about school absenteeism as being problematic, we're talking about absence from school that's, 25% of their school time within 2 weeks, or like 10 days within about 15 weeks. Again, a lot of times it also gets confusing because sometimes children miss school for reasons that have nothing to do with truancy or school refusal. It has to do with parents maybe withdrawing them from school to take care of a sick relative due to financial difficulties. So it really gets tricky as to, do you call it school refusal behavior to describe everything that happens to lead to a child not going to school? So usually it seems like school attendance problem is kind of the general catch-all term of, hey, if a kid's not in school, it's a school attendance problem, whether or not it is something that is controlled by by the child's behavior, by a parent decision, whatever the reason, it's a school attendance problem if a child is not in school.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So we see a lot of factors in terms of, the research as to why might a child miss school. A lot of time it might have to do with sort of, socioeconomic class. So lower socioeconomic classes, families in that group tend to have children who might struggle to go to school. They might have lack of parental supervision. But you also see it often linked with children who have a history of depression or anxiety, or a history of being bullied, low social skills, or challenges with social skills, I should say. And usually what happens is when a child, it's noticed that they stop going to school and no one's quite sure why and where they are, and they call the parent and the parent says, "I've been struggling, I can't get my child to school." Then usually there are a couple questionnaires. One is the self-efficacy questionnaire for school situations, which I've never used. This is the first time I think I'd heard of. Well, I might have heard of it before, but there's a lot of acronym questionnaires and they all kind of do very similar things. It's not fun. But that looks at self-efficacy around problematic situations in school. So again, how well do you think you can handle school? And then the school avoidance scale revised, the SRASR, which again, I keep saying, every time I say the acronym, I feel like I'm saying a different title. It is very hard to keep track of all these things. But the SRAS, which we did a whole episode about, and that just looks at sort of the general 4 functions of why might someone refuse to engage in a behavior like going to school. And the 4 functions tend to kind of categorize as negative reinforcement to avoid social situations, negative reinforcement to avoid school or testing situations, positive reinforcement from attention from the parent, and positive reinforcement from access to activities or preferred activities at home that you can get at home. So this is just a questionnaire. It's a Likert scale. How often do you feel this? How often does this happen? How often do you go? And I've given this a number of times. And one of the questions I always come up with is, A, this is a lot of verbal behavior. Is this really going to demonstrate the function of the school refusal? Because verbal report is not the same as nonverbal behavior. And there's always a question of, are people telling me honestly what they think? There's also the question of, some of these questions don't exactly line up with what we think of as those 4 functions.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of them also talk about the idea of, well, this is a symptom. This is something that is happening to me, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is the function of the school refusal. Because, if I ask a question like, oh, do you often, think you have less friends than other kids? I might say yes for a lot of reasons. And that might have nothing to do with why I don't go to school. I don't go to school because I get to play video games when I stay home, let's say. Would be kind of like the most easy, basic response.
You would love that, by the way.
That would be super fun, right? But the fact that I don't have a lot of friends at school, I don't really care. I'm not much of a friend guy. I like to do my own thing when I'm at school. I just have more reinforcement when I'm at home, right? Mm-hmm. So you might be getting some false positives in that regard. So the authors here said, all right, well, the SRAS is a good start, but Could we look a little closer at some of the details? Because also when we're talking about these 4 functions, you do miss some amount of detail. And there are follow-ups, and there are certainly other questions and interviews and observations you can do as part of an SRAS that you should do if you're considering it a functional assessment, because just doing a questionnaire, I think we would say, is a type of assessment. I guess it legally falls under the category, but I don't think any of us would be like, yep, I did a questionnaire. I'm all good now. Time for treatment. I know everything.
Yeah, it's not the only thing that we could do.
Yeah. So the goal here for the authors was to say, all right, well, let's look at a new questionnaire. I wish they come up with something else, but it's just a different questionnaire, right?
Well, maybe it'll capture more, right?
That was the goal. Can it capture more information about specific challenges related to attendance? Can it differentiate between discussion of symptomatology around school attendance problems and potential functions of school attendance problems? Can it look at more specific barriers? Because again, with the school refusal, the SRASR, you're usually talking about a student who is currently not going to school. Could this be a more sensitive measure of students who struggle going to school? They may become school avoidance or school refusers. They're not at the moment. It's just a lot of stress on the family unit, right?
It does make sense, too, that I know in these situations they would just do an assessment because they might not have the resources, right, to do some more in-depth observations. They don't have a U, maybe at some public schools, right?
Yeah.
But again, we should always be striving to hashtag do better, right, and not just use assessments.
Exactly. So what if we took a lot of questions about cognitions, about behaviors that are proximal to the school avoidance behaviors? We look at kind of thoughts around school. We talk about somatic complaints a little bit more, right? So let's get a little more detail. Awesome. That's great. I love the beginning of this article. And that is why the authors created the Inventory of School Attendance Problems, or the ISAP. And that's when the article fell off a cliff for me. So it did what a lot of these articles looking at tests and questionnaires do, which is they ask a great question. They set up a good tool that has a lot of sort of common sense kind of responses. And then they statistics the hell out of it. And they tell you at the end, the statistics were good, therefore this is a good test. They bring up some good questions at the end. So it's sort of a great article of like a great beginning, terrible middle, great ending. Terrible from what I like to get out of an article.
Right, yeah. But I mean, if you love yourself some statistics, where statistics is necessary sometimes, right? You do have to look at good internal and external validity, and you need, when you're doing these masked assessments that are just question-based, right? We got to make sure that they're experimentally sound. But yes, it is a lot harder to read if you're a behavior analyst that hasn't had a lot of experience reading statistical analysis and knowing your p-values. Sometimes when I'm reading, I'm like, oh, my eyes like glass over. I'm like, skip to the discussion.
It's a lot. I tried to pick out some key points that I think are relevant in terms of an overall discussion of school attendance problems. But again, the middle part is a lot of, hey, did you know that these things are correlated? I have statistics to tell me so. Like, that doesn't necessarily make me feel like, and that makes this a much better questionnaire than the other questionnaire I was using before. But again, I think this is an area that needs a lot more research. And I don't know if it's because it's too complicated or behavior analysts don't know. That's the point of this episode, right? They don't know this is something that they could be involved in and support.
What would be really cool is if you use these 2 assessments, design treatments about them, and saw which assessment led to better treatment efficacy.
Yeah, there's a lot of good recent school refusal or school attendance problem articles that I have in a big folder, but I'm not doing as much with that this year. So I will get to it at some point, but it is not a focus of much of my professional time right now. I'll get to them though. But in any case, they had like 245 patients who were at the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, Psychosomatics, and Psychotherapy at a university hospital in Essen, which, fun fact, is where they hold the prestigious Spiel des Jahres board game awards ceremony every year. So exciting.
I don't even know what that is.
It's like the German Best Board Game Awards.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. They all had, patients who reported school avoidance problems from a variety of inpatient and daycare kind of hospital units. They were all, around like 14 years old, and they kind of took a test they've been working on for the past 2 years in terms of looking at questions, and they gave it, and they looked at statistics. So the test itself was developed by sort of asking a lot of questions about emotions and the thoughts that could go with those emotions to really look at how can we tell the difference, or is there a way to tell the difference between things that students say that they are feeling or things that they are thinking before that might be related to a function, but don't necessarily point to a function without kind of the subsequent statistics, right? So they categorize these all by various themes. We'll talk about some of those themes. And then they sort of generated a whole bunch of items. So they had 124 in their pool to start, which is a lot of questions. This is a much longer questionnaire than I believe the 30 items or so that are in the SRAS are.
You might get a questionnaire fatigue.
I know. I think I'd be having a questionnaire avoidance behavior by the end of this time. So some examples of sort of how they kind of conceptualized the questions where they think about, okay, well, social anxiety, right? What are the sorts of things we might hear for a child to describe or a teen to describe social anxiety? They might say things like, I'm afraid to speak to other students. That might be something they say. And looking at those patterns, they develop questions in which you could sort of rate true, how not true, how related to me on questions like, I worry that I might embarrass myself, right? So they would just sort of take these thoughts and these kind of patterns of responding, and they put together these questions. For example, another one, somatic complaints. It's going to be something about feeling ill. So you're hearing people talk about, oh, my stomach hurts, my head hurts. So, the question might be something around like, I feel sick, endorse, don't endorse. So some of the categories they came up with had to do with the idea of separation anxiety, performance anxiety. So again, a lot of mentalistic terms. So I know a lot of people are already like, oh, that's not a thing, or that's not the way I describe that, or how's that going to give me a function, right? General school aversion. So the idea that school is boring. Alternative activities to do at home or outside. Opposition towards just the idea of going to school. Agoraphobia. Fears around reactions to absences. I like this one because this is one I have actually seen. The idea that I had a different function for my school avoidance, and now the function is I'm scared everyone's going to ask me where I was. So it's sort of you kind of lump it into an anxiety, but slightly different function than just the I didn't want to go to school because attention or because access to reinforcement, right? Tiredness, depressed affect, low self-worth, hopelessness around your school situation, bullying, conflicts with peers, which again, two different things. Peer isolation, bad relationships with teachers. That's a really important one. I think, again, that could be captured by the SRAS and some of the questions about school setting, but is a little bit different, is a little bit more fine-grained as to what is the aversive situation at school, potentially.
Right.
Fears about teachers, dislike of their specific school. So it's just my school. I hate this school. Concerns about getting to school. Again, that's not really mentioned very much in the SRAS. Yep. Dislike of just a specific class. Bad relationships with parents, problems with families. So all of these categories, again, capture, I think, a lot of the kind of nitty-gritty detail that might go into some of the other assessments or might be able to be described generally as negative reinforcement or positive reinforcement. So they told everyone, here's how you fill out the form. Here's the difference between questions about your symptoms and questions about the functions, which I'm not quite sure how they described that to all of these teenagers filling out the form. But
mine was that way as well. So I would have liked to seen it.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, they're saying, okay, we're going to look at statistics and we're going to pick what are the questions that are relevant, what are the questions that don't. So they do statistics, they do a factor analysis, yada, yada, yada. But again, this is really just going to compare all of the different items together to see, do they sort of clump into the categories they would expect? How do they relate to some of the similar components on other similar school avoidance tests, right? Because if they have similar, statistical values as those, or they sort of lump into the same groups as those, then they're probably on the right track with a lot of these questions. So they'd find sort of patterns. They'd look at sort of correlations. They look at mean differences. They look at the kind of correlation between function and symptomology, which is really a big thing they were interested about.
That's kind of neat, right?
Yeah, I like that part. Yeah. I mean, again, it's statistics. It's not necessarily behavior, but it could point to patterns that we might want to look for in an observation or in a more direct assessment of behavior. Right. And you'd find things, they found a lot of what they'd expect. Sometimes writing these I read these research papers about, we made a questionnaire. It's like, I know you're going to find something good, because if you found like, yeah, what a disaster, all the statistics pointed to no significance, you wouldn't have published this paper. So it's almost a foregone conclusion that like, look at all the great stuff we found here. Aren't we great? But I guess that's true about most published research to some extent.
Yeah, there's really not a lot of null results.
But you'd find things like there was a strong correlation between depression and somatic complaints, which again, I think is true to sort of what we think about when we think about depression and we think about school avoidance. I don't feel good. I can't go to school. Similarly, correlation between depression and performance anxiety. Sometimes you see correlations between things like problems with peers and depression, or separation anxiety and panic or agoraphobia. Again, you might expect to see some of those correlations there.
And agoraphobia means you're scared of leaving your house, right?
Yes, you have anxiety response about leaving, going into open spaces.
Okay.
Pretty much. You'd see things like problems with peers were associated. They didn't say correlated. I can't remember if that was a note change or if they just wrote associated rather than correlated with a lot of different categories like depression, other somatic complaints, social anxiety, which again, a lot of these statistics kind of make sense in the idea of, well, if you have a lot of problems with your peers, it's going to result in a lot of other challenges that you might have, or the challenges you might have are going to result in a lot of problems with peers. We're not sure the direction of that relationship, if there even was one. And then when they looked at correlations between the ISAP and other tests, including the German version, man, if you love acronyms, the German version of the SRASR actually has a different acronym than SRASR. I'm guessing it's in German or something. I don't know. It seems like there's too many acronyms. Why are you having more acronyms here?
That would be very hard.
And they saw things like, okay, something like separation anxiety is highly correlated with some of the other tests kind of scores on things like aggression, which again could make sense because a lot of times if a child is told you have to leave your parent, they might have a tantrum, they might become aggressive. Or things like the idea of, dislike. Oh, I love this one. Dislike of specific school had a high correlation with scales regarding kind of the negative reinforcement questions on the SRASR, the German version at least, and tangible rewards. Tangible rewards were correlated with a lot of scores here on, school aversion / attractive alternatives. So again, this test, which has been used for a long time, points to, tangible rewards as a function, and it relates and correlates with the same questions that would look at tangible function. So again, hey, great, look, our test is about as good as this test, or as good in this area as this other test, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, at least it's as good as.
Yeah. So again, you get all these statistics to point to, I guess this test does the things it says it does. These questions are related to these types of functions. These functions are related to functions from other tests. So I guess it's a good test in that very specific regard. And the authors do sort of speak to the idea that, I guess we made a test that statistically looks good, but does this actually answer any questions? Mm-hmm. Does this tell us more about functions of school attendance problems or school avoidance? Does this allow us to look at a more fine-grained hierarchy of what treatments are in order? Because a lot of them have to do with sort of like a cognitive behavioral therapy approach.
Right.
Would the ISAP rather than the SRASR tell us more about the specific kind of triggers, which again might not tell us, well, you now don't have to do cognitive behavior therapy, but it might tell you, here's your hierarchy of anxiety responses that you're going to work with the student on. And of course, there was a really great find that dislike of specific school they found had low correlations with all the other scales, which they posit might just be that adolescents don't like school. So it's not kids saying, I don't want to go to school sucks, is not actually related to school avoidance problems. It's just a feeling that all children have.
And it's an adolescent feeling.
It's an adolescent feeling. School is dumb and I hate it, which I think tells us a lot about the schooling systems in many parts of the world.
That's funny.
So again, here's a questionnaire that can be used. Has it been used with kids who aren't engaging in school attendance problem behavior? Not yet, or it might have been since it was published. I could not find anything else. The only other reference I found talking about the ISAP was another study looking at school attendance problems that just used the ISAP, which again feels like, they're beta testing something, which again, I can't get too upset about it. I know I read plenty of research that there hasn't been a lot of replication, but it sounds like an exact solution to a problem I might be having. And with enough oversight and with a knowledge of what we know and don't know, I think you can sort of start using that in practice, even though it might not be necessarily an evidence-based practice. It is a practice that has research methodology behind it, so it could be supported by it, but we just wouldn't call it an EBP. We just call it something that has research behind it. We're going to try, and we're going to look at these pieces. So again, I like the ISAP. I think there are a lot of cool questions that are not a part of the SRAS. I might even try using some of the questions as I do the SRAS. So maybe looking at the SRAS, kind of where do I see the function going, and then maybe using the ISAP to ask some more specific questions.
Well, that's nice. But it would be hard though, right? If you're like a new clinician, and like for me, I've never done that type of school avoidance or school refusal at all. So then like when you have a lot of assessments, it's left wondering like, which assessment should I use? Mm-hmm. Which assessment's going to be a better indicator or help me make treatment, right? And so I sometimes wish people would just take the assessment that there is and then make that assessment a little better so that there's still only one assessment. It's like something revised. right? But I guess maybe you can't do that if you own rights to it.
Maybe, yeah, and sometimes it does feel like a weird science business problem in that it's great that these questions are being asked, but yeah, wouldn't it have made sense to say, well, what do we not know in the SRIS? Could we use some of these questions to sort of dig deeper, or is this a good follow-up? But again, we don't know. This is a new assessment. I think, common sense wise, does ask questions that are related to school attendance problems that I often have even after doing an SRISR, but it isn't, none of these are observable. This is all reporting of verbal behavior.
Right.
Now, what you could do if you wanted to make it more behavior analytic would be to use this almost like you might do a FAST, although I would, again, probably jump to something else rather than a FAST, but bear with me for the thought experience, the thought experiment.
Oh, I'm excited.
I might use this to sort of gather information about what is the student endorsing as relevant to their school attendance problems. And therefore, what are the areas I might do more direct testing and assessment? The simplest one being if I see that the student is talking a lot about, say, somatic complaints around, and then, what do they do when they're home? I get to stay home or I get to engage in these activities.
They get to watch Price is Right.
Exactly. What if I told you they're all at your school right now and they're not at home, they're actually at school? Does the child then go to school if they can engage in those activities while they're at school? That might, really solidify my hypothesis. But again, I think one of the challenges is most people ask these questions. They say, oh, based on these questions, here's the general function. And then here's kind of a shotgun approach to all the treatments that we're going to use that maybe takes out. So again, if it's, talking about adolescents, it's almost never separation anxiety from parents. Again, is it separation anxiety and they just don't want to admit that they miss their mom and dad when they go to school to some random guy who's talking to them? Perhaps. But, again, you could ask them questions like, what if your parents came to school with you? But again, they're going to say, no, absolutely not. I do not want my parents coming to school. So it's really hard to test some of these hypotheses. Mom. Oh, yeah, the cool mom?
I'll be the cool mom. My kid will be like, I absolutely want my mom to come to school. She's so cool.
She's so
I'll
cool.
be like Drew Barrymore when she goes back into high school.
Never been kissed?
Yeah. Thank you for that reference.
There you go. So again, it becomes one of those questions of, are we good enough with the questionnaire? Do we need to then do follow-up observation to really test our hypothesis? Would there be a faster way to do a direct assessment that didn't rely only on verbal behavior? Or are these problems that a verbal report is good enough? They even mention in the article that in some respect, it might be irrelevant whether, or at least some of the article, I think as some of the articles you'll be discussing, Jackie, that idea, it might be irrelevant whether or not you think the respondent is being truthful. As long as they believe this is the function of their behavior, your ability to validate and speak to that truth may be enough to build a therapeutic rapport to allow them to sort of test that hypothesis on their own.
Right.
So, again, I think we could talk more about this in Dissemination Station, but I think there are some steps that probably need to be taken. But the question always becomes, well, do we need to take those necessarily? Should we be taking them? What are we missing with questionnaires like this? And this is a really thorough questionnaire. It looks really good. It seems to have all the statistics in place, but does it improve our ability to provide a treatment package? And that they don't know. So, oh well. Well, that's school attendance problems. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about assessments related to non-suicidal self-injury. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking about behavior assessments you didn't know existed. But before we get into a further discussion, I want to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. And by listening, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening, then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, or click on the link in the podcast player's show notes section and enter in some information, including 2 secret code words. I'm going to give you the first secret code word. It's such a secret. It's CLAN, C-L-A-N. I think it's usually associated with sort of, Scottish families, right? Like Clan MacDuck, which is sadly where I got that code word because I've got a Uncle Scrooge comic book sitting on a bookshelf talking about clans.
Yeah, there you go.
But maybe it's your video game group of friends. You play Fortnite together in a clan. Any way you slice it, the code word's clan.
Hilariously, I didn't even know Fortnite was a video game. Isn't that
Wow, you're not going to be the cool mom that way.
I know. I'm going to be like the weird, crunchy mom. Like, do you want some granola? I just baked it on the outdoor oven.
No thanks, Mrs. McDonald. I'm going to go over to cool mom's house. We're going to play Fortnite.
Okay, and I'll be like, what's Fortnite? Is it a newfangled outdoor game?
It's like a hula hoop.
Oh, man. Okay.
All right. So again, Jackie, I appreciate that you gave everyone kind of a trigger warning. So folks, if you are either uncomfortable or the discussion of self-injury is going to be a trigger to you for whatever reason, we are going to be discussing that at length until we get to the dissemination station and then probably somewhat in there. So no harm, no foul. If you do not want to have that discussion right now, the episode will be here for whenever you decide that you think it is relevant to you, if ever. But with that being said, we're going to talk about assessments related to the function of non-suicidal self-injury.
Yeah, I'm also going to make the caveat again that this is not something that a traditional behavior analyst would do. This is not something that you would just be like, I can handle that, right? That wouldn't be something that you're like, I'm doing it and I have no extra training. Then you would be behaving unethically outside of your realm of competence. So just be aware that these articles are not behavior analytic, but I think we as behavior analysts need to get comfortable reading articles outside of our field, looking at where we might be able to contribute to the interdisciplinary team, right? Mm-hmm. So obviously, I wouldn't want to be doing any of this alone. I wouldn't want to be doing any of this at all because I have no training. But if I did have that training, I would be working as a team to do these types of assessments.
Yeah. Or you may be working with a team who has a lot of experience, but might have some questions related to the idea of functions of behavior, right. and you're supporting that very small sliver of the overall treatment package. Absolutely. Only with support with other folks with more training.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to start with a brief definition, and I love it when definitions are the exact same across articles. Both articles, the definition of non-suicidal self-injury, the acronym, because everyone loves acronyms, NSSI, is defined as a deliberate, direct altercation or destruction of body tissue without conscious suicidal intent. So behavior such as this is typically deemed socially unacceptable. And they give an example that this is like a nice way that they do up the operational definition here. They're like, ear piercing would fit this definition, but it's socially acceptable, so it no longer fits this definition. Mm-hmm. So I really liked that. They said that it is repetitive and it must be direct. So they say this is an opposite of is indirect harm, such as when you drink and then drive, right? Because there's only potential for harm. But with non-suicidal self-injury, it's directly harm.
Cool mom might tell you it's cool to drink and drive, but cool mom is wrong.
Cool mom is definitely wrong. And an NSSI, I'm just going to call it self-injury, but we'll just say that it's non-suicidal, might cause minor to moderate harm, right? So typically, clinicians will see this type of behavior in both outpatient clinics, so at the doctor's office, at your urgent care, but you'll also see it in hospitalization settings and psychiatric units and in inpatient care. So they said, generally, what researchers and clinicians know about non-suicidal self-injury comes from those psychiatric inpatient units. Surprisingly, this seems like a high number for me, but 4% of the population, the entire population, has a history with non-suicidal self-injury, and it's thought to begin in adolescence, which doesn't surprise me, right? So adolescence is a time where there's a lot of angst. and more discovering of yourself, right, too. So who knows the function why, but that wasn't surprising to me.
Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty wide category that could be included in SSI. So things like, mild forms would be like pulling hair. I mean, I don't pull my hair like trichotillomania type pull my hair, but I like that sensation of, it's more like a running fingers through my own hair, but sometimes I'll give like a little tug. Or when I was first growing a beard, I would sort of futz with it and like, oh, this hair's out of place. And I kind of pull it and you get that like, oh, that feels kind of good. So I guess that would fall under the category of NSSI. I am not an adolescent though, so.
Well, they would say that's only mild, so it might not.
It might. Well, I think it would count in terms of the category. No one would care or give me the FASM questionnaire because of it, right. I don't think.
And so another thing that I think it's important to note is that there isn't a lot of research surrounding non-suicidal self-injury with adolescents, which is surprising because that's where everyone thinks that it is the origin, and there's just not a lot of research surrounding that.
Yeah, I mean these are a little older articles, so some of that may have changed. We were really just looking at articles around functions or that mention functions, so we're not really sure the landscape in psychiatry right now or psychology on this research. In
Netflix, thinking about representation mattering, Netflix has a show called Ginny and Georgia, and they represent an adolescent who engages in non-suicidal self-harm in the form of burning oneself. So yeah, so categories include cutting type behaviors, hitting or biting yourself, abusing pills, eating disordered behavior, reckless behavior, bone breaking, falling or jumping. And so that's kind of the general category, right? So that things will fall under there. And the previous literature suggested that functions or why people engage in these behaviors include, and spoiler alert, these are not behavior analytic, but I think they could rest in some behavior analytic categories. So they include relieving a negative emotion, relieving any sort of anger that they have, such as like guilt, shame, right? Anxiety. It removes attention toward unpleasant thoughts. Some feel that it provides a sense of security or control over oneself when there's not control over other situations. It could be a punishment to ourselves or setting boundaries with other people. And so those aren't behavior analytic. But I think, when you're looking at those four, our four bins of function, I think it can fit a lot with automatically maintained behavior and a lot of socially mediated behavior, right? And so I think it's funny, they do say that in one, they're like, and it's like one sentence, and it's like, as this article states, it could be automatically maintained or socially mediated. And I'm like, doesn't fit, but I'm proud of you for putting it in there.
I think it's that same challenge of when they're talking about the functions, they sort of interchange this idea of, well, there's more to life and there's more detail and there's more richness to discussing things, either using mentalistic language or in describing observable but kind of more detailed kind of confluences of events, rather than just throwing them into the two bins of automatic reinforcement or sort of negative reinforcement or social reinforcement, social positive reinforcement.
Right.
And it's not like either one is right, but it is sort of funny how they're like, well, I guess you could lump them into these categories, but we don't want to because we want to get deeper into the.
But they don't even say that.
But they don't really get any deeper into it. It's just the same old questionnaire.
They don't say it, right? They're like, it could go into these categories, and then it just moves on. And I was just like, oh. And so following these episodes, adolescents reported feeling relief, a sense of calm after engaging in self-harm. So really what this article wanted to do was to explore the prevalence and characteristics of self-harm, non-suicidal self-harm in adolescents, and they wanted to use a largish sample of the community population. And what they were looking at is to see whether there were other factors that could help, I guess, determine, effective treatments and or determine if somebody is denying self-harm or outcome measures if they're engaging in moderate to severe self-harm. And so, so they had students do a survey. Again, it's just self-report. They had recruited students from the South and the Midwest, and they just went to some they said non-random high schools. So it was probably high schools that they had some contact with, right? They were like,
Cool high schools.
we know the principals from these high schools. And they recruited from classroom announcements in the public schools. They used grades 9 through 12, and they had a total of 663 students. 57% were female. The average age was 15.5, but up to 18. 50% were African American, 43% were Caucasian, 1% were Asian American and Latino, and there was a few that had other. And I think that's important to note. Also, I think it would be interesting, I don't know if we should say it here, but it's interesting who completed the questionnaire, right? And they didn't really give us a ton of information on those who denied engaging in self-harm versus those that did engage in self-harm. So those that did not engage in self-harm, maybe they didn't consent to do the study, right?
Yeah.
So even though they thought they had a big sample, it may have been selected, right? So they used the functional assessment of self-mutilation. This was the questionnaire that was the one that's available. And this was designed to figure out, and this is my language, what type of self-injury was occurring, when it was occurring, and then the severity of self-injury across two different parts of the assessment. So the first part of the assessment was a checklist, which sounds kind of good and nice, right? It's a checklist, and it includes all the behaviors that are considered part of this non-suicidal self-injury. And so the participants just had to go down and check off which behaviors they engaged in the past year, and then indicate how many times they've engaged in the behavior and whether they receive medical attention or not from that behavior. And they said that they included the medical attention part because then it can indicate the severity of the behavior. Although not necessarily always, right? Like you could really hurt yourself and not get medical attention, right? But that's what they were using.
Because you're like John Wick or something.
I don't know who that is, but...
The John Wick movies?
I don't know.
Keanu Reeves?
I don't know.
Oh, geez. Wow.
Yeah.
You're never going to be a cool mom at this rate, Jackie.
I know. I actually have given up on being the cool mom. That's okay.
Just within the span of our episode.
Right. So the first factor, that first checklist included items that were considered more clinically severe in nature. And those included like cutting or carving, burning, self-tattooing, scraping, and erasing. And I didn't know what erasing was, and so I love that they gave me a definition. It's using an eraser to rub skin to the point of burning and bleeding. And then the second factor of the checklist consisted of less severe behaviors. So these were denoted as minor. They were hitting self, pulling hair. There it is, Rob. Biting self, inserting objects under nails or skin.
Oh, that one gets me. That's not...
Picking at a wound and picking areas to draw blood. And so then one thing they did note is that they took out the picking at a wound because all of the students said that they did that, and it may not necessarily denote a non-suicidal self-injury if you have like a scab and you cut it off.
Yeah. Or so they took it out if that was the only thing that was referenced on the forum was, I think it's scabs.
Yeah, so then they took that out. Okay, so then they looked at the age of onset, whether they were under the influence of drugs, the degree of pain that the injury had, and then whether there was a suicidal attempt. And then the second part of the assessment was statements that you would rate it on a Likert scale from never to often about how you felt about, right? This is where they're trying to determine the function. So this is where I think it would have been interesting to figure out like what they're asking them. But it kind of looks like the FAST in a way, it sounds like, right? Like, and when I feel stress, I engage in this behavior. So I'm thinking that's kind of like it. And so again, they compared this result with the suicidal ideation questionnaire to look at whether there was previous suicide attempts, hospitalization, or previous psychiatric or mental illness. So when the students did fill it out, they filled it out during their regular school day. It's like in homeroom, so it doesn't take from their times, right? Students were informed it was an anonymous survey looking at how teens deal with certain emotions, so they didn't talk about self-injury, which I thought was interesting that they didn't bring that up. Then they had to receive informed consent for both teens and the parents, and of the 670 students initially, only 16 chose not to participate or weren't present that school day, and 21 of them provided incomplete or unusable questionnaires, which is so typical adolescents. Right? They probably just were like, I'm done answering these questions.
Yeah.
And then following the completion of the survey, they were debriefed from the study and given a local mental health hotline. And the results were interesting that it was much higher than I had expected and much higher than the researchers had expected, where 46% of their population had a non-suicidal, self-injurious behavior in the past, and 28% of them were moderate or severe. So the most commonly were biting, cutting, carving, hitting, and burning your skin. And so that was pretty high. The authors were surprised, and they said that it might have been because they used a checklist, and the checklist might have yielded higher responses than a write-in option, which was previously done.
I mean, that makes sense. I wouldn't have put the fact that I sometimes pull hair as, that would fall into the category of NSSI. I wouldn't have put that before. But if it were on a checklist, it's like, I guess I have done that.
Right. And they did say that moderate or severe self-injury engaged in more frequent and more types of behaviors, reported that they had more pain, reported that they engaged in that behavior when they were doing drugs, reported that they received more medical treatment, reported that they were hospitalized due to the self-injury, and had suicidal attempts. So here the authors posit this is like their take-home point, is that this assessment did point out all of the non-suicidal self-injury responses that adolescents are engaging in, and they are engaging in them at that higher rates. And I can imagine even now after COVID-19 that it's probably higher, right, given the stress and mental health of the world today. And they said that this might be helpful to distinguish between minor and moderate self-injury, for help in getting medical treatment, for the complexity of the medical treatment. And they did say that the most common reason that adolescents reported that they engaged in self-injury was to get a reaction out of someone, to control the situation, and to stop bad feelings. So attention, automatically maintain behavior, and some sort of, we don't know what the bad feelings are, but it could be some aversive, like trying to escape aversive situations.
Could be automatic negative kind of reinforcement.
Right. Yeah. So the authors were surprised that they thought that non-suicidal self-injury was more socially maintained than in previous research, because previous research suggested an automatic function. And they said that maybe they should start using this assessment in order to inform treatment.
Yeah.
My second article was like the FSAM was the best that everybody had before, but it failed to account for variables found to affect self-injury in the literature. So they said, for example, functions related to sensation-seeking behavior, coping with suicidal thoughts, and interpersonal boundaries. So this study did something similar to yours, where it had a new behavior, the Inventory of Statements About Self-Injury, the ISAS.
And this one was like 2 years after the other study, which sort of feels like you didn't want to do a FASMR instead, or kind of work on that one.
Yep. So this one wanted to look at functions that the NSSI left out. So they had an initial section that
the FASM left out.
Yeah, that the FASM left out. Sorry, they had an initial section that assessed lifelong repetitive using these 12 behaviors, and they said with purpose without a suicidal attempt. So the nice thing is that they did use the same definition for non-suicidal self-injury, and this was captured in college students and not in adolescents. So the population is different, and there has been research looking at college students engaging in these behaviors, and it is quite high. So it's not surprising that they found 235 college students out of 700 that were reported to be recruited. They were in lower psychology classes in a northeastern university. I want to know which one.
Oh my goodness.
I probably could find that out by looking at where the author is, but I didn't. It's probably BU or BC. 55% were female, 41% were Caucasian, 39% were Asian, 6% were African American, and 14% were other ethnicity. The mean was 18.5.
Which makes sense for a lower numbered psych class. You're probably a freshman or a sophomore. So
that makes sense. You're probably just 18. And so if you answered yes to one or more of the first section of engaging in non-suicidal self-injury, then you were asked to move on to the second section, where they literally were only looking at potential functions. So the functions were affect regulation, anti-dissociation, anti-suicidal, autonomy, interpersonal boundaries, interpersonal influence, marking distress, peer bonding, self-care, self-punishment, revenge, sensation-seeking, and toughness across. So they had 3 different statements each of those statements corresponded to one of those hypothesized functions. Feels very much like the FAST, right?
Mhm.
You add up all the numbers. The number with the highest number would be your hypothesized function, or multiple, right? Because they had 13 possible ones. And then they also looked at the results of the depression, anxiety, stress scale, the McLean screening for borderline personality disorder, and the youth risk behavior survey to assess the validity of this other assessment. Seems like a lot. And I really didn't have much to say in the results because they really were, look, this seems to be a good indicator of figuring out why people were engaging in non-suicidal self-injury, but then they gave nothing else. And so I felt a little lackluster in the results in the discussion.
Yeah.
They were just like, more research needed, and maybe we can use this for treatment, but didn't tell us like what kind of treatment or like where. So, I mean, I get that it's a new assessment again, but they didn't, I felt something. I felt sadness that I didn't get more in that discussion.
Well, they had all these different potential functions, which again, we might say, I don't think these, that's not well described. You can't operationally define some of those. But in the end, the statistic did out and it came out to, it seems like the functions are kind of always going to be, some sort of social reinforcement or automatic negative kind of reinforcement. They didn't call it that. I think they liked the term. They have to know they like the term interpersonal and intrapersonal.
Oh yeah,
function,
they love that.
which I think is even less. That's an even more worthless set of terms than some of the other ones they described there. Like, what is it? Intrapersonal? What the heck? What does that mean? And they have a nice appendix where they describe what some of the. So because I was wondering, I was like, what is tough? What the heck are they talking about? Toughness?
Yeah, they do have a nice appendix.
I can stand the pain.
Yeah,
that's why I'm doing. So I guess that would be some kind of a automatic positive reinforcement, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, you could go through here, and I think you can throw them into bins, right? But I was still looking for a little bit more.
Yeah, but I think that does. I mean, this is probably a good point to kind of bring us to dissemination station. I think that idea of I was looking for a bit more. I think that is really true about a lot of studies in which the goal seems to be to make everyone want to use your questionnaire. And I don't want to paint with too broad a brush in that these are 3 very specific articles, but really only one, really 2 of them spent a lot of time trying to talk about correlation between other tests and sort of general trends that statistically might be seen. So to sort of how could you use these assessments to look for correlations, which feel like a good big picture question. Certainly knowing things. So certainly looking at the FASM and looking at statistically folks who report more types of self-injury are more likely to either have a report of more complex mental health issues or that are more likely to potentially try or become suicidal in the future. So that is a very useful and very valuable piece of information, but it also doesn't tell you the function of the self-harm, nor does it give you a clear treatment plan other than what one might do sort of as an emergency plan to avoid suicidality occurring. The ISAP similarly talks about general themes and has some questions that may, when you read them, may support your hypothesis building around one of the 4 main functions you get from the SRAS in terms of looking at more detailed situations that may warrant further observation or further antecedent manipulation. But again, it's just a questionnaire.
Yeah.
So I think what we have here and what we're kind of going to wrap up with is the idea that these aren't journal articles that you're going to read and now say, aha, now I can determine the function of non-suicidal self-injury and school attendance problems. Because I don't think you can determine the function any better than you probably could have without these. Maybe a little better. I don't want to.
Yeah, I think a little better because we do get more information, right? So I think you're more, instead of doing nothing versus doing something, it's always better to do something. But it would be really interesting if future research could look at these assessments and then design treatments around these assessments, obviously with the help of professionals, right, when you're talking about suicidal self-injury, and then assess whether the treatment effectiveness matches up to the proposed function. So I think that's where we need to go for that, for both of them.
And I just don't see, and maybe I'm not looking in the right places for some of these, because certainly we're not going to see a lot about school refusal in behavior analytic journals or look at self-injury outside of maybe like what we think of kind of as traditional SIB in behavior analytic journals. But I often do not see, or I see a lot of these questionnaires get used, and then it sort of feels like an afterthought of like, we did these questionnaires and then we did a treatment. Would we have done that treatment without doing the questionnaires? I mean, possibly.
Yeah. But maybe not, right? But
maybe not. But it does sort of lend itself. And I don't always see a lot of studies on efficacy of we used this questionnaire to develop this treatment and we did it. I would love to see maybe like a case series.
Yeah,
we used this. Cool. We determined these would be the treatments. We did that treatment. And these were the results we saw. We saw the decrease in the school attendance. We saw at least reported decrease in the non-suicidal self-injury. I think this is something, and this might be something that maybe behavior analysis can add to these fields of supporting, looking at more single study designs. Again, it'd be great. Maybe you could help out with like a randomized control trial. But again, are you going to do a randomized control trial for these very specific behaviors? The statistics or the percentages of individuals who report these behaviors occurring are somewhat high, but not enough that you're going to go to the trouble of making an RCT for these people who reported self-harm. We actually gave them the questionnaire and then gave them a matched treatment. These people, we gave them the questionnaire and we gave them some random treatment or business as usual or wait
kind
list.
Of mean. Yeah.
That seems really mean. I don't think you're going to get an IRB to sign off on the study of like, we just figured we'd shrug at those people until such time as we got our results. And so I think really like the case series is probably the closest you're going to get, unless you get one of those, like they talk about on Freakonomics, where it's like, and then there was an earthquake, so they couldn't do their therapy, and that's how we got our RCT without doing it on purpose, like when it's an accidental RCT.
I love it.
Yeah, I would definitely love for us to sort of look at some of these questionnaires as much as we could with the training that we have, and really look at, well, what are we expecting to see? Do these questionnaires allow us to do more effective antecedent manipulations? Because a lot of times that's what you're going to do.
Right.
Or to focus our treatments, which again, a lot of them are going to be maybe cognitive behavior therapy or DBT or possibly ACT. Does this allow us to make a better intervention in those areas? Or would we have done pretty much the exact same thing, the exact same treatment? I think of like hierarchies for like school attendance problems. You make a hierarchy of anxiety. So if a child is reporting that they do have high answers related to I'm avoiding school situations or I'm avoiding social situations, you're going to, the first line of defense is, well, we do CBT and we make the hierarchy of those situations. Did you need to do the questionnaire, or could you have just said, we're just going to do CBT about anxiety because there's always anxiety with school refusal, right? So let's just assume it's these things. And then they'll tell us in the middle of treatment, I don't like these parts of school. And then we'll do our treatment around those areas. And in that case, as much as I don't want to say, well, don't even do the questionnaire, is it that useful a tool? Could we come up with a better tool by just doing more direct observations? Yeah. Or are these behaviors that, based on how they occur, we really can't do much more than look at verbal reports and then propose hypotheses that might make treatment more efficient? But I think that's a place where, folks who are working in these fields or who have, maybe they are behavior analysts, but they're more, behavioral psychologists. I would kind of love to see them taking a crack at some of these areas and looking at what is important here. What gives us better information? Are there tools that we could use these starting questionnaires to do more direct testing? Do we need to do more direct testing to get better results? Or can we just say, everyone gets this treatment and it tends to be pretty darn effective? Why, we don't know. And then we could look at the why, because we're at least helping people. So I do think we have some questionnaires. We have some interesting ways to think about functions of behavior. But again, I think this falls into that category of why don't behavior analysts study some of these? And some of it is very complex. There is a lot to it beyond the questionnaire. It's not repeatable in some cases the same way that a lot of the problem behaviors we study are. But I do think...
And finally, we might not have the competence.
Yes, definitely might not have the competence.
Training in graduate school in order to deal with these behaviors. Not always.
No, but I see the word function. I want to see a little bit more than a questionnaire. And that's not a knock against people who made the questionnaire, but I think there's a little bit more that we could add to these discussions. It's a good starting point. Yep. All right. So Diana's not here, but she said she doesn't want to miss the food cart with a little dose of pairing. So I'm going to drop in her pairings here.
Hi there, everyone. It's Diana. I'm so sorry I couldn't join you for the rest of the episode, but thank goodness I'm here now, just in time for your favorite segment, Pairings. In this segment, I'll tell you some other episodes you might want to track back and listen to in case you liked this episode, as well as something that you can enjoy to eat or drink while you listen to one or multiple of these recommendations. So for this episode, I thought that you might like to go back and revisit some similar topics that we've talked about in the past. These might include episode 57, in which we discuss school refusal. We also have a bonus episode as well, in which Rob talks to Christopher Kearney about school refusal, so you could definitely go check those out. We also have an episode on anxiety, episode 192, anxiety assessments with Kira Moore. And I also felt like this episode generally would relate to some considerations on culturally competent assessments too. So we discussed that in episode, I believe it's 104. It's 104. It's episode 104 with Elizabeth Hughes Fong. So any of those may be ones that you want to go back and take a visit to. And then, I wasn't really sure what you might want to eat or drink with this episode, because I feel like this is one where we were talking about things that are kind of outside of our typical elements. And I know that there was a lot of discussion within this episode on scope of practice and incorporating and bringing in others to work with you. So these were some topics that maybe felt a little bit outside of your element. You weren't sure what to do with, right? So my recommended snack to have with this episode is something that is a little bit unusual, and that is a beef consomme aspic. You may be wondering what an aspic is if you're not sure. It is like a Jell-O mold. So it's like a beef gelatin, like a beef soup gelatin that is shaped into a mold and congealed. And then you can eat it if you so desire. So that's what I'm recommending that you have with this particular episode, because it's something that I would not know how to make. I would have to go get someone else who knew how to make it to help me do it. It doesn't exactly sound appealing to me, perhaps because I don't know too much about it and because I would need to learn more. And maybe it's a little bit of an acquired taste, and it's definitely outside of my wheelhouse. So all of those things made me think of this episode and why you might enjoy an unusual treat to go with this unusual episode. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Wow, those were good pairings. We had a great time hearing them. I'm so glad they were there. So with that, we come to the end of the train and the end of our show. We hope you enjoyed it. We'd appreciate it if you subscribed on your favorite podcast player, maybe even leave us a little review about what you thought of the show. There are some other places you can get in contact with us. Certainly you can email us at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. Have you used some of these questionnaires? Is this something that is a part of your practice? Because I don't know a lot of behavior analysts that are doing school refusal and school avoidance problems. I don't know a lot that are talking about non-suicidal self-injury. Some. So please reach out if you have used these questionnaires and if you've had similar questions or had some addenda to these types of questionnaires in your practice. We would love to hear about that. You can certainly find all of our previous episodes as well as links to the articles discussed today on abainsidetrack.com, as well as to purchase CEs for the majority of our episodes. And you can find all of these posted on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature. You can reach out on all the socials as ABA Inside Track. And if you want even more ABA Inside Track content, go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can subscribe at the $3, $5, or $10 level. At that $5 level, you're going to get access to our quarterly live episodes, as well as a free CE. We have a very special live episode coming out soon, where we're going to be talking with Babbitt student members about what are the lessons that we want to impart upon them as they enter into the career field. But that will be available for our patrons as well as our previous episodes. And if you subscribe at the premium $10 level, you're able to get access to our quarterly book club podcast, where we just did our recording on the Skeptic's Guide to Looking at Data, Calling Bullshit. We had a lot of fun saying that word over and over and over again, as well as access to all of our previous book clubs, again, for 2 CEs each. So it's quite a value to hear even more of your friends at ABA Inside Track. And I did not forget. We want to make sure you get the second secret code word, which is farewell. Farewell. So apropos of where we are in our episode, because we are winding down, but not without saying one final thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his fabulous editing work. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!